Hello, I'm Royal Orr. Welcome to our special Epiphany series of conversations starting off the year 2025, the year in which we will be celebrating the centennial of the founding of the United Church of Canada. Joining us this week, three great guests, as well as our regular anchor, Brian Arthur Brown. Our guests today, David Roger Gagnon, James Christie, and Lloyd Axworthy, talking in that order about Francophone ministries in Quebec, the multi-faith dimension of the life of the United Church of Canada, as well as the social gospel, the importance of social justice in the history and the future of the United Church. These are just sketches we're giving you. We're encouraging you, of course, to reflect and think and read, especially read sections of the book by Brian Arthur Brown, The Untied Church, that touches on some of these issues. But right to it. David Roger Gagnon is a proud Acadien. He is now the lay minister at St. Paul's United Church near Moncton, but has been deeply involved in the creation of new communities of faith of the United Church for a number of years, both in Quebec and in the Maritimes. David Roger, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So can I just ask you that general question? When you look to the future and you think about Francophone ministry, French language ministry in the United Church, what are you seeing?
Well, a couple of things. One is actually a return to our roots, because I think we forget as a denomination that the original parts of the Francophone ministries go back to the 1600s. The Huguenots who came to these shores were part of our tradition and part of our history and became a covert part after there was a change in power and all that. There have been Protestant efforts to build new communities in French across Canada at several different times in history. The last leading up to when we joined at Union, 93 congregations, preaching points, and ministry areas, not to mention the 23 in New England that were Francophone ministries. And so it's a kind of return to part of our history and part of our past by looking forward. And looking forward now is a little different. And the needs in the Francophone communities across Canada are a little different depending on where they are geographically.
Okay, so let's maybe look at some. I should mention that I already mentioned you have a lot of history thinking about community building, community development, especially for new communities of faith. So can we talk about some of those identifiable groups or demographics, as we say, within Canadian society, within Francophone Canada, where you think there's some real opportunities, or we actually already are having some successes with creating these new communities of faith?
Well, I can speak to what's going on the ground here in Moncton right now, in Greater Moncton. I'm working in Riverview, which is a former kind of suburb. It's its own city, but has a changing demographic. And more Francophones and more newcomer families are moving into the neighborhoods surrounding St. Paul's. So there's an interesting demographic shift that presents some interesting opportunity. And in the 5 months that I worked in collaboration with La Table des Ministères en Français to see what's going on the ground, we've been able to identify 4 different areas that we think are worth exploring. One is obviously the established Acadian populations. In Acadie, there has been sort of a just slow drifting away from church adherence and church connection. And that is an interesting opportunity for us because we're not dealing with the radical shifts that we saw in Quebec's situation. So the challenge there is that they just don't know who we are, but there's a large openness among Francophones to the resonance of the values. So that's one area. The newcomer populations, we have quite a few Francophones from other parts of the world who are finding Moncton a nice sized city, a good place to land in Canada to get used to our winter, but also to find services and schools and other things where they can live in French and connect. And so I've already begun meeting with families from Cameroon and a few other African countries who are Francophones and who are looking for a place to worship. There's also l'Université de Moncton. L'Université de Moncton has a significant portion of its population who are Francophones from overseas, some of whom from Africa and other French-speaking countries, but also a large population of Acadians who don't have a traditional connection to church. So there's a whole opportunity there to reach out. And then the fourth is LGBTQ work. We are going to house here at St. Paul's the newly forming New Brunswick Gay Men's Chorus called Chorus, Khrous. And already some of the men who are expressing an interest have come to St. Paul's and have been surprised by the openness to LGBTQ family members. And so there's a whole other area of ministry among Francophones that we can explore there as well.
Okay, interesting. So maybe let's focus on one group or one of the sectors that you identified there, because I know certainly here in Montreal, there's some significant interest in this, and also in Toronto, and probably actually further west as well. And that is the so-called diasporic communities of faith. And what opportunities are there, not just in terms of creating new communities of faith, but actually making bridges with their home churches in the countries they have come from. So can you talk a little bit more about what's going on there? Because you've had some, again, hands-on experience, not just in Moncton, but also here in Quebec with those communities.
Well, we're very lucky in the United Church in that we have been able to welcome some folks who are already well established ministers in their own right from their own home countries. I'm thinking of Isaac and Florence as examples of ministers who have come to us from overseas, who have broad connections in their home churches in Africa, who have been able to reconnect with folks here. And so, thanks to them and other colleagues, we've been able to connect with folks. For example, there are cell communities of Cameroonian families who have been evolving into communities of faith. A prime example of that is the community that's worshiping now in Saint-Lambert, in one of our established English-speaking churches. They evolved out of a situation in COVID where when the ministry, Francophone ministry in Toronto went online, they were able to reconnect with all these folks from Cameroon that knew of this ministry. And so when we went back into in-person worship, the community in Longueuil said, well, what about us? We want to continue. And so 50 families already formed the nucleus of that first group. And we already have some of the folks connected to that whole group here in Moncton that we're starting to connect with as well.
Well, so we have mentioned the Cameroonian people who are coming together. There's also Malagash people in Montreal, the Reformed Church that they come from as well. There's the beginnings, I understand, of Kiswahili speaking connections in Quebec City. So that's all coming together. So when you are approaching these new communities of faith or potential communities of faith, whether it's the choir or international students at the Université de Moncton or like all of those sectors. What do you say about the United Church? How do you position the United Church? What do you tell them about who we are?
Well, I think it's, first of all, just to establish a relationship with these folks, to let them know that there is a Christian community that is welcoming and diverse, that accepts a broad spectrum of people from a broad spectrum of cultural backgrounds, of orientational backgrounds, of theological backgrounds, that we're a church of dialogue and consensus, a church of conciliar structure. And I think that that's quite interesting to folks who come from other experiences of church or churches that are similar in nature in terms of structure. That opens the door, especially with the Acadians. It's very intriguing to a lot of Acadians that there's a conciliar structure, not a hierarchical structure, that we ordain women, that our ministers can be married, that we're LGBTQ welcoming and affirming. I mean, all of these issues are quite unique and interesting to a lot of Francophones across Canada, Quebec and Acadie and other parts.
And when you get a little bit deeper into the conversations, what do you say about how the United Church understands Jesus as the Christ? Does that become a topic of conversation?
Well, it's interesting you asked the question because just this week, at the beginning of the week, I had a Francophone Acadian who came in who is interested in the chorus. And we got into this very long conversation about what's the United Church's view on hell and on Jesus and all of that. And it does come up because I think there's a hunger for spiritual connection within Francophone populations, be they newcomer or established. And I think that the way that we are able to talk about Jesus without the heavy-handed sort of dogmatic approach allows room for conversation. And I think that's what's refreshing. And I think that's what's attractive to folks who are in Francophone communities.
Mm. David Roger, thanks for joining us for this little quick sketch. Really appreciate that. And stick with us because we've got some other great conversations coming up, beginning with James Christie. Jim is originally a Montrealer. He's ministered in churches in Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto. He's been Dean of Theology at the University of Winnipeg, also president of the Canadian Council of Churches. So not surprisingly, we're turning to him to talk about the ecumenical, multi-faith dimension of the life of the United Church, not only in our past 100 years, but in the 100 years to come. Jim, great to have you with us.
Great to be here, Royal, and good to see friends on the screen with me, and to know that there are out there myriad friends across the United Church of Canada that I'm happy to be in touch with through this broadcast today.
Well, I do know that you many people have been touched by your ministries, your various ministries over the years. So can you give us a little bit like David Roger did, the sketch of the multi-faith dimension of United Church life?
Well, I'd like to pick up directly from what David Roger was offering in terms of ministries in the Francophonie and to some measure beyond. I'd like to pick up with two things. My career in ministry and my vocational life actually corresponds to the second half of the history of the United Church of Canada, starting in 1973 to the present. And if there are two things that I would want to emphasize and nothing else, the first is that everything about our ecumenical and interfaith relationships in Canada and around the world begin on two premises. The first is that we spent the last half century learning. And some of that learning comes from heartache that at first seemed to be trauma and then turned out to be, rather than trauma, extraordinarily beneficial to us as a community and to the wider community beyond. The second thing is to emphasize, just as was implicit in David Roger's comments, that the United Church is essentially a congregational church, which is in keeping with the church of the first century. The essence not only of church, but the essence of Christianity was established not in our four beloved Gospels, but in the letters of St. Paul. No matter how obscure they sometimes seem to be, Paul was writing to congregations, to groups of friends who were gathering to promote and to live as faithfully as they knew how in their era the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, in our first half century, the United Church was, in many respects, both intended to be and was a reflection of Canadian society in the second quarter and beyond of the history of Canada. And we were reflective of that in so many ways, sometimes for good and sometimes perhaps not so good. There was, I think, a touch of almost, I hate to use the term because it's appropriated by so many others, but a kind of manifest destiny. This was the way the church was going. Brian notes that in part in his history, brilliantly encapsulated in chapter 16 of The Untied Church. But we had a shock beginning the second half of our century when the House of Bishops said, we really don't want to become one with you. And at first, that seemed devastating. And then we began to realize that what that was doing was bringing us to a point of reckoning where we had to determine where we were going to go. There was a kind of crisis of identity in 1975, which led to our reassessing who the United Church was in relation to others beyond our immediate congregational ecclesial life. And that emanated in a number of studies, including towards a renewed ecumenism, which attempted to ask the question, well, if we're not going to build this mega church worldwide, beginning here in Canada, what are we going to do? And so we had to learn and learn seriously by listening.
Well, and take seriously the multi-faith, the increasingly multi-faith dimensions of Canadian society and Canadian life. I mean, with the extended reflection on our relationship with the Jewish community and then with Islam. So it sounds to me like, coming out of that 75 shock, as you characterize it, was like a radical opening to religion generally.
Very much so. And in consequence, during our second half century, we've gradually become more to reflect a different kind of Canada, a different Canadian society, and I would say one that is overall a better society than that of my youth and childhood.
Okay,
But
so Jim, can I just ask though a little bit about, because the trends are happening simultaneously, right? You have the trend that you're talking about, which I think we all would agree has led us to a place that is the place we should be in terms of openness and learning and listening and all those great things. But we've also had this demographic trend in terms of church participation and church attendance. Some people sort of say that those two things are linked, but I personally am a bit skeptical of that. But how do you build in these sort of changes of Canadians' relationship to faith with these new understandings of the complexities of faith in Canadian society?
well, I think, Royal, it's worth remembering that a connection to faith and a connection to organized religious institutions are not synonymous. The second thing is to begin to realize that Mark Twain was right. There are lies, damn lies, and statistics. So it might interest our community to realize that after the First World War, the rough attendance of church across the country in all expressions was, except the Roman Catholic, was roughly 11% of the Canadian population.
Mhm.
In 2025, we're running at roughly 11 or 12 or 13% of the Canadian population. It's a
Mhm.
little difficult to get overly concerned by the reality that after the Second World War, flush with victory, we decided we were going to build a church on every corner, and not just a church on every corner, but if you take a look at North Toronto, a cathedral on every corner. You could swing a cat and hit a United Church. Not that you should swing cats, of course. It's an ancient and antique expression. But it was the ecumenical challenge that the Anglican Church of Canada triggered that led us to rethink ecumenism. It led us to rethink ecumenism first in the Canadian Council of Churches, which, to note again Brian's excellent history, the Canadian Council of Churches is not a member of the World Council of Churches. It's one of 9 regional church bodies internationally. And the United Church is, in fact, a member of both the World and Canadian Council. And
Yeah.
that's significant.
Okay, but can I also though ask you about the relationships? I mean, we have traditionally been comfortable talking with Anglicans, Lutherans, sometimes Catholics, but have we really kept up with the developments in terms of the explosion of Pentecostal churches, for example, or the ongoing strength, it seems, of evangelical approaches to the faith? I mean, what's the nature of our relationship there, and have we succeeded in making the kinds of bridges that we should have with those expressions of the faith that seem to have more energy than our approach?
Well, this, Royal, is why you make such a great interviewer, because it's a segue in part into what I imagine Lloyd and you will be talking about in just a few moments. Um, we have done a much better job at relating to Muslims and to Hindus than we have to Pentecostals and evangelicals, because there is this ingrained understanding that somehow our values are different. Meh. Having said that, the United Church, as a key player in the Canadian Council of Churches, is now organically engaged with the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. And in fact, the United Church and the EFC, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, have been key partners since the turn of the century. I want to touch before we slip on to Lloyd, though, in terms of a global perspective, on possibly the most unique things the United Church accomplished during this last half century. And those were our lens, mending the world, tikkun olam, through which we try to view everything, including our reinterpretation of social gospel. We have 4 extraordinary groundbreaking pieces. The Bearing Faithful Witness, which was the first, and seemingly forgotten given our relatively poor response to the growing anti-Semitism since particularly the Middle East crisis currently underway between Israel and Gaza. It would be good, perhaps, if the General Council Executive and others reread that document and understood its significant import. We were the first religious community of significance, Christian, on the planet to recognize Islam as a world religion. We broke new ground with Circle and Cross to realize that it is possible for Indigenous spirituality and the gospel to live comfortably side by side and in partnership. And we're still beginning to just touch the surface of what it might mean to be in some form of relationship with Hinduism worldwide.
Mhm.
On top of all that, a decade ago, we began to explore with our partner church, the United Church of Christ in the United States, the possibility of multi-religious belonging, which is worth an episode someday just on its own. But
Right.
effectively speaking, the United Church has been in a process of growing up. Like Canada, perhaps like the world, this last 50 years has been an adolescent experience as we bang heads around, trying this, trying that, hoping it'll work. And by and large, we're still here, and that in itself is of significance.
I like that image of us as still being kind of an adolescent church or just coming out of adolescence as a church with all the challenges that brings. Jim, it's been great to speak with you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Rob. Thanks.
Turning now to our next guest, Lloyd Axworthy, well known to Canadians for an extraordinary career both in politics and academia. A writer, recently came out with a new book called My Life in Politics, and we're going to touch maybe on that a little bit, but mostly to talk to Lloyd about social gospel, its importance in the United Church of Canada, and its future in our next century. Lloyd Axworthy, welcome to this conversation.
Nice to join you, Rob. Thank you.
It's good to have you with us. Social gospel. I think all of us know that it's deep, deep, deep in our roots as the United Church of Canada. What does it mean, and what's its future?
Well, I can only speak in a very personal way, but you mentioned the memoir I've written. It really begins with a discussion that Jim Christie and I had on a somewhat slushy spring afternoon in Ottawa at the Ritz Canal restaurant on the canal. And I was there to talk to him about the whole issue of just law. I was a foreign minister. As a country, we had become engaged in one of the most unique humanitarian initiatives of actually having to use force of arms to stop the humanitarian extinction in Kosovo. Many church leaders were opposed. Prime Minister and I had met with a group. It certainly jacked up my sort of interest as someone who had grew up in the United Church, and particularly, as I will get to, the tutelage of Lois and Roy Wilson, the apostles of social gospel in Winnipeg at the time. And we spent a good afternoon talking about how did my faith exercise itself in the decisions we had to make on a very crucial issue, committing our own sort of men and women to become engaged, and also deeply concerned about the impact this would have on civilians. I won't give you the conclusion because I want you to read the book in order to get the kind of conclusion on it. But it did remind me that as I started to write my book, just how much my association in the United Church, beginning in growing up in the north end of Winnipeg, where our family attended the Atlantic Avenue United Church, a very small place just on the corner of Arlington and Atlantic Avenue. And we had the incredible privilege of having Lois Wilson and Roy Wilson, a team just newly minted out of the United College Theology, which those of you who know your history will know that United College was the successor of Wesley College, which was the spiritual home of social gospel in Canada, where we had the J.S. Woodworths and the Ian Blands and all that together. And they brought a very practical, very important social gospel message to us, which is you practice your faith by what you do to make the world a better place. Mm-hmm. And we were a bunch of kids in the kind of youth program that would gather in their basement on a Sunday evening and have it out. In the meantime, growing up in the North End, there was a number of pockets of poverty. There was clearly a lot of diversity at the time, and I learned from them. And it's been interesting that as I track my different checkered career along the way, how often, just to give you another example, is when I was attending graduate school in Princeton, United States, my summer employment was with Charlie Forsyth at Elgin Avenue United Church, and we did what we call street to recreation. He and sort of asked Mike Quiggin, who also became a United Church minister, and I, if we would simply, in the inner city of Winnipeg, where there's no open recreation, we'd go to street corners at 5 o'clock every night with balls and bats and crayons and stuff, and provide street-based education. And I remember, again, Charlie Forsyth and his wife Myrna being a huge influence. To relieve the pressure, they would take us up to the Lake of the Woods, where we would go in his little putty motorboat and raise our fists to all the big, wealthy, spatial villas that were on the shores.
Well,
And
yeah, what the portrait you paint of social gospel. I mean, it's everything from that street corner ministry all the
uh,
way up to, should we use the force of arms in
right,
Kosovo?
that's
That
right,
that example reminded me actually of the controversy when the United Church decided to support the ANC.
right,
Um, and that was hugely controversial within the church
exactly, sure.
in terms of, whether the commitment or the support of violence in
Hmm.
support of overcoming injustice, whether that was Christian or
Mm.
not. So, Lloyd, so you see the impact that a childhood and an adolescence and a young adulthood in the United Church has had on you. Can I ask you though to look at the contemporary situation? I'm thinking of this morning's headlines where,
Right,
like the head of the Red Cross is saying humanitarian law is no longer being
sure.
respected at all in the world. So what's the space for social gospel, whether it's that street corner ministry or supporting international efforts in terms of getting respect for things like international humanitarian law?
Well, in this moment of darkness, I again go back to my roots, and part of that social gospel education was an extensive reading of Reinhold Niebuhr when I was in graduate school, and coming, basically the thesis that the world is a very dark, black place, but it's up to the children of light to provide some alternative to it. And I think we're in that situation right now. It hasn't changed. And that it can and should express itself in public policy, in personal behavior, in institutional support. And I think that I can't speak for the church as a whole because I'm unlike the rest of you. I'm not directly involved in it other than showing up the odd time for putting my collection in the plate, but I certainly am very much. I will give you one example where I think there is a contemporary. Uh, as you know, in 2004, I was invited to become the president and chancellor of University of Winnipeg, which was again the latest iteration of United College, Wesley College. It's an inner city university, but it wasn't dealing with the inner city community. It had sort of designed its identity as providing good, solid education for upper middle class kids in Winnipeg. That seemed to me to be wrong, and there was no question. So I took some big risks. I hired Jim Christie to come Martino theology, a wonderful guy named Terry Hidachuk, who was the pastor of St. Andrew's River Heights Church. And we just listening to your previous conversation about how do you connect, we established a very strong relationship, a spiritual relationship with our indigenous community. Tobakat Kanu, who is the father, our present premier, was our elder at the university. But it was through them that we were able to all of a sudden reset the role of the university, what we call the community learning strategy, where we can directly engage in opening access for inner city, Indigenous or Métis, First Nations kids, as well as others, newcomers. New, we had a community learning center both for global and inner city working at the same time, and we try to translate those activities into what I think we, at least at the time, really changed the nature and role of the university. And I think, Jim, I think it's fair to say, for a period, we were leading the university community in Canada about that concept of community learning and the accountability. And there's no question that I remember I just before this thing early this morning, I went back and read a paper I had issued. I think it was in 2009 to the Senate of the University of Winnipeg on community learning, and my beginning is the roots in social gospel, and to
Right.
simply say that is
Yeah.
those are the fumes that we're still inhaling.
Yeah. Listen, Lloyd, it's great to hear that you think we can still perhaps be children of light in this dark world.
Mhm.
And I'm sorry our time is so brief here this morning, but I want to say thank you. And I want to remind people, we've mentioned it already, that Lloyd Axworthy's new book is called My Life in Politics. Some people on screen here have already read it and they've given it high praise. So
Right.
thanks for
Thank
being
you.
with us.
My
And so
pleasure.
Okay, so let me turn now, as he has often done so far in our little series, to Brian Arthur Brown, just to kind of wrap this up for this week. Brian.
Sure, thank you very much. I've read Lloyd's book, a wonderful book, and Jim Christie is featured in part of it, and there's much of a chapter on social gospel and so on. Um, we could think a little more sometime about the church in politics directly, not in a sense of partisan politics, but nevertheless direct involvement. Uh, the best example I could come up with was just a little after Lloyd left the House of Commons, uh, when the House of Commons was voting on the gay marriage bill.
Mhm.
The moderator of the United Church of Canada, Peter Short, went to Ottawa and met with 51 United Church members of Parliament from all parties and leaned on them. We would say whipped them, leaned on them all to support the gay marriage proposition. And they all did. And it passed. And it might well not have passed without that happening. There's a great story about the Prime Minister at the time, uh, uh, Paul Martin, being threatened with excommunication from his church. But his wife, Sheila, a United Church member, said
Right.
not to worry. He'll be happy in my church if that happens, and so on. So there's also that direct connection sometimes, but the underlying thing that Lloyd described was perhaps more important in the long run. But it's an interesting topic. Now, Jim didn't mention shared ministries as he might have if he'd had more time, because part of what comes out of his area of discussion is the larger number now of ministries in small places like Chetwynd, British Columbia in the north, where both the United and the Presbyterian Church might have closed, but became one joint ministry. And that's a step even beyond shared ministries that we have with Anglicans. And there are a lot of those across the country and so on. So we have to think about that. The best example that I can think of is right in the head offices. There's a new United Church head office being built, a tower, a skyscraper in the back parking lot at Bloor Street United Church in Toronto. And it's going to open next year. But to everybody's surprise, the Presbyterians decided to sell their building and to move in the United Church headquarters. What's this? They're moving now. The United and Presbyterian not getting married, but they're moving in together. Is this a sign of the times? Next thing we know, the Anglicans decided that they would like to share office space in the same facility, and so we that now that's not a throuple, but it's a new day in ecumenical relations, and bodes well for the whole church. So there's exciting things going on, marvelous things going on, even within the United Church itself, but also in these connections, whether in Parliament or ecumenical or whatever. These are great days to be in the United Church. Now, David Roger spoke about the growing Francophone ministries, and while the United Church remains an important factor in English community life in Quebec, also besides that, a most amazing symbol of future United Church vitality is the example I could give you of the recent rally. We mentioned it a couple of weeks ago, the recent rally of 100 Black Francophone immigrant youth in the United Church in Sherbrooke, Quebec. This is beyond amazing, beyond. And the thing I want to mention is that they're not only Black, Francophone, and immigrant, they are youth. There's a future of the United Church happening before our eyes. And it's not all just in sharing and connecting with people of other religions and other denominations. There's amazing things going on within the United Church, and it'll relate to those other things that we've spoken of and so on. Well, all those things will be reflected in the cluster anniversary services in June. There was a book before the one that we're studying, the Keys to the Kingdom, is a book that maybe most of you have read, that describes all the things that have been difficult and gone wrong in the United Church. But we've been studying the sequel, the Untied Church of Canada, the book, and it's about the things that are going forward, both in the ways that are connecting with others and in our own experience, and so on. So, if you're in a discussion group, and many of the viewers of this program are in discussion groups, if you're in a discussion group, I'm going to suggest that you spend part of the time this evening in celebrating chapter 16 of the Untied Church of Canada. You might look at that one, which is about unity, division, diversity, and shared ministries. Have a look at that. And then next week, as the church in media ministries has moved from radio, which we did half well, to television, which we didn't do so well, to live streaming, which we're doing better and better, and now to AI connections in artificial intelligence. People are saying, how's that going to affect the church? Well, we raised that question with respect to live streaming and even TV and so on. And it's going to affect the church tremendously. And that's our subject for next week. I'm going to suggest, if you're with a group or even if you're alone, that you read the last 3 pages in chapter 5 to get ready for next week's discussion. And with Royal's help, we've got some good guests. So we're looking forward to next week, and we'll see you then.